Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar called Ensuring User Happiness with Application Quality Monitoring. So before we get into the program today, I have a couple of brief housekeeping announcements. The first is that today's presentation is going to be followed by a live Q&A. At any time during the presentation, feel free to type a question into the questions tab of the control panel. Hit submit, and we'll get to as many as time allows. And those questions, again, can be asked at any time during the presentation. Secondly, this presentation today will be available on demand on the sdtimes.com website within the next day or so. So you can watch it over and over again, share it with your friends, send the link as a holiday present, whatever you want to do. It'll be there for you. Okay, so as we've been writing about in SD Times, user experience has become a more important factor in determining a business's and an application's success. And there are lots of ways to ensure that user experience is of high quality. And perhaps one of the best ways of doing that is a technique called application quality monitoring, which is what our presentation is about today. So here to tell us all about it is Joe Godfrey. He's the CEO and head of product for a company called Airbrake.io, and he spent the past 20 years building products and services for companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and a handful of startups. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to begin the program.
Thanks, David. Much appreciated. Hello, everyone. Thank you guys for coming. As David mentioned, this, in addition to them putting a rebroadcast out for everyone, all these slides will also be available. So if any of you guys are frantic note takers, you can kind of put your pens down. If it's easier, you can just go through this stuff later. As David talked about, this is about really, it's titled Application Error Monitoring, Application Quality Monitoring, but at its core, this is about user happiness and about making sure that all the efforts and energy you put into delivering a great user experience, a great experience for your customers, actually turns out that way as opposed to sort of being for naught. So I'll run through these slides relatively quickly, just because I don't like to sit and just talk without feedback. So run through them pretty quickly and take questions toward the end. But if you guys have questions along the way, by all means, ask those, and I'll try to address those in the flow as well. So real quick, just what we're going to talk about today. The user is king. Really, they're the whole reason that you do what you do. The whole reason you build the service you build and provide it to people. Probably you're investing a ton of resources and money and time and energy into user happiness, but more than likely, it's coming up a bit short of where you want it to be. And that matters because at the end of the day, user happiness is what's going to make your business succeed or fail. And then we give you a little bit of an overview on what you can do to basically improve that and make sure that all the other resources you're plowing into user happiness and user experience actually result in the service being something your users get excited about. And then, like I said, we'll jump into questions. So user is king. Again, this isn't news to anyone who builds products and services for people. Users are the ones who buy your products, they consume your content, they click on your ads, they promote, or worse, they're the ones who say bad things about your service. Anything that you do, anything you build, one way or another, you are trying to delight users in some way so that you can monetize it in some way. And if your users aren't happy, at some point, sooner than later, your key performance indicators are not going to be happy either, and the service or the business you're building is not going to be the success that you want it to be. There's a few key practices that basically every company employs as part of trying to delight their users. Develop a delightful and intuitive user interface. Some people sometimes refer to as UX. That really just shows users you value their time. Don't make them take 5 clicks if they can do something in 1 or 2. Present the information in a logical way. This is all kind of standard stuff that we invest a lot of time and a lot of money into. Ensuring your service provides real value, that's kind of a no-brainer. If you're not helping your users solve some sort of pressing problem or delivering some inherent value, then what's the point? They're going to move on to something else. Most companies, though not all, do some kind of application performance monitoring. Really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how great whatever you built is and how useful it is if it doesn't load. If your servers crash or it takes 30 or 40 seconds to load something, then it doesn't really matter how great it is. And then, of course, delighting your users with great customer service. No matter how well you do anything, you're going to have problems and you're going to have confusion, and being responsive to your customers, addressing their needs, et cetera, is just a critical part of any great product or service. So all these steps are critical, but none of them really account for errors, what some people refer to as bugs. So if a problem is fatal, your performance monitoring might notice, but is it going to tell you how to fix the problem? Is it going to tell you the root cause and how to get your system up and running as quickly as possible? Usually not. If the error or the bug is along an intended user path, your automated test might catch it. But what about edge cases? What about the core cases that you hadn't thought of? And are your tests even up to date? I spent the early part of my career in QA, and I've written a lot of automated tests, and I've spent a lot of time trying to maintain automated tests. And inevitably, we reach a point where the tests aren't as comprehensive as they used to be. A test starts failing because somebody's changed something and it's creating false positives, so we kind of turn those tests off until we have time to go back and fix them. And at some point, you end up with a bit of a patchwork that maybe isn't as robust as you would intended it to be. But even when it was great, it missed a lot of edge cases or different, browsers or different environment issues. If a bug or an error is directly affecting your sales, your metrics monitoring might tip you off. If you see that sales are off 10% since your last release, you'll probably start figuring out that something is wrong, but where do you even start to look for the source of the problem? You probably start looking at the checkout page or the last place they buy, but it could be that the problem is 6 steps earlier, or that it's only affecting a certain browser or some other issue. So you're really back to guessing again, trying to figure out what is this problem that's costing me revenue and how do I get it fixed as quickly as possible. And if you have great customers who love your product and service, some of them will probably let you know that they're running into problems. But in the course of that, how many other customers you don't have as much loyalty who are trying your service for the first time, just don't have the energy, how many of them just got frustrated and left? So look, if you're doing all these things, these are all great, these are all important, you might be okay. But more likely, you're going to end up with some very, very frustrated users, and you're going to end up with a lot less of those users than you would have had if you were on top of any of these problems and proactively discovering them and fixing them. Okay, so errors are bad. That's pretty clear. They impact your application quality, and most importantly, they impact your customer experience. So it still leaves the answer of what do we do about it? How do we today monitor for bugs and errors? And look, too often, from my experience, it's a hodgepodge of brute force manual work. And this is kind of, I've been working in the tech industry for over 20 years. And this speaks to a lot of my own personal frustrations. And part of why I'm trying to do what we're doing here at Airbrake is to solve a lot of these problems. When I was at Amazon, I would spend hour after hour grepping logs. We'd do a software release, and I'd have 8 terminal windows up on my tiny 15-inch tube monitor, and each terminal window was grepping through a different set of logs, trying to filter out known problems or minor problems or just looking for serious problems, kind of matrix style, just looking for this proverbial needle in a haystack, because logs get busy and logs get cluttered. I talked a little bit before about automated tests, but again, you spend a lot of time updating those, dealing with false positives. Spend a ton of time watching your KPIs and your sales metrics, looking for drops, trying to figure out if that drop has something to do with software you just launched, or something a competitor's doing, or some totally unrelated thing like a holiday in the UK where you have a large customer base, whatever it might be. Using your customers as testers. I mean, this was a standard Amazon practice when I was there. We would get stuff out. We'd say, this is pretty close. Let's push it out, and let's see who complains about what and what goes wrong. And lots and lots of manual testing. Whether you've got QA engineers on staff, or you use a service like test.io that lets you outsource your QA, or you have your engineers just doing it themselves, chances are you're spending a lot of time testing, or at least trying to verify issues found in the automated test, or again, digging around trying to figure out why your KPIs are wrong. So it's a lot of work. And again, the results can be mixed at best. So we did a survey last year talking to engineering teams, and 80% of the respondents that we surveyed said they spend at least 7 hours just putting out fires after something they would term as a good deployment. So this is something where generally things went well and it was pretty successful. And when deploys went poorly, that estimate more than doubled. So basically, anytime they were releasing software, and this is, this tended to be folks that were in an agile or a waterfall model. Continuous deployment has a different set of challenges, but even when things went well, the status quo was they spent way too much time running around in a fire drill trying to make sure things didn't get worse and trying to figure out what problems were affecting users and getting those fixed as quickly as possible. And that's time that could have been spent writing more code. That's time that could have been spent working out the next set of features, squashing other bugs that you've kind of been putting off for a very long time. So that's a lot of time wasted, especially if you're releasing on a frequent basis.
Hey, Joe, I just wanted to jump in for a second. Isn't like CI and CD supposed to reduce that 7-hour time frame in terms of getting more continuous feedback loop and being able to make changes a lot more quickly?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, look, we're a continuous deployment shop ourselves. We release, generally dozens of times a day, depending on what we're working on. And it does help reduce that time for sure. The problem with CI and with CD is, we release, it's 10 o'clock now. We've got a lot of engineers over in Europe, so we've probably released at least 10 or 12 times already today, something. Right. If we discovered a problem right now, immediately the issue we'd have if we discovered a bug or an issue, a customer said, hey, I'm having this problem is, shit, I actually don't know which release caused that problem because we've done so many releases today and maybe even into yesterday that now it's not as simple as, oh, this is a serious problem, we should roll it back, because the question would be, roll what back? And so immediately we run into an issue of, if you're doing an agile release and you're releasing once every 2 weeks and something goes wrong, you pretty much know that it's what you just released, you can roll it back. But if you've been releasing continuously, you really don't know what the problem is. And we'll get into this a bit in a slide or two here, but one of the great things about error monitoring is that it takes all of your errors, it dedupes them into a unique set of problems, and it will show you when that problem first occurred, and it'll give you all the information about which release caused that problem, which line of code, et cetera. So you're not guessing anymore and trying to quickly figure out, crap, do I roll back? Do I try to debug and solve this problem? You can dive in immediately and say either, okay, I understand what the problem is, I can fix it, or I don't understand what the problem is, but I know which deployment caused it, and I can roll back at that deployment without rolling back all the other great things I've done today. Good.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, so it's a great question. That slide did kind of talk a little bit or point to an agile or waterfall model, but it's just as important, if not more so, in a continuous deployment world. So application error monitoring, loosely defined, is about helping you identify unique problems. So again, your logs, you might have thousands or tens of thousands or millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of items that happen every day in your logs, but you might only have 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 unique problems. Error monitor is about finding those unique problems, getting it in real time, and giving you all the information you need to prioritize and fix those most critical issues, as fast as you possibly can. And then, really, how do we do that? So the first phase of that is identify and prioritize. So a tool like Airbreak and error monitoring in general will monitor your deployments to see when new errors are introduced and confirm when existing errors are resolved. So I've talked a lot about being aware of new problems, but just simple things like, hey, we set out in this release to solve this specific bug or this set of bugs. Did we actually do that? Did we really solve that error, or did we just solve part of it, but it's still happening for a set of users? We can tell you that. Getting instant alerts when new errors occur. So, again, after we used to, in most of my history is in software development, release time meant monitoring time, which meant, again, monitoring the metrics, but also monitoring the logs and monitoring the user queues, et cetera, trying to figure out if any new problems have happened or any existing problems have gotten worse. With error monitoring, we spot new problems for you and we send you an alert. an email, a Slack message, whatever it might be. So you don't have to sit there and monitor. You can let us tell you, hey, a new problem has happened, and dive in here to understand the details. And then again, grouping these into a manageable number of unique problems. So instead of having, hey, since the launch, we've had 100,000 things pop up in the errors, it's like, okay, that's great. How many unique problems have happened, and how many of those are new versus pre-existing problems? And then, of course, being able to prioritize those. So whether that's by what's happening most recently, or what happened first or last, or what's happened the most, or something like error weight, which is our proprietary ranking algorithm that kind of gives you a sense of what you should tackle first. Giving you kind of all the tools you need to say, here's the state of the world, here's new problems, here's your total set of problems, here's the ones you should tackle first. This is that first phase of getting a sense of like, okay, now I know what I need to tackle, and I've got a unique, manageable set of things I need to tackle. And then the step two, of course, for that is, okay, how am I going to do it? So this is the react, resolve, and improve. So this is anything from, diagnostic information, a breadcrumb trail that tells you here's all the things that the user did, as well as all the different functions the application called just prior to the error being triggered. Aggregation data that shows you things like, here are all the users who were affected, here are the browsers they were using, here's the URLs that the error was triggered on. I could spend the next hour running through all the use cases for that, but I think it's a lot of it is self-explanatory that if you want to reproduce a bug or an error, understanding all the different scenarios in which that error did or did not occur is incredibly valuable. Simple things like knowing that this is a Safari problem that doesn't affect Chrome and Firefox, or knowing that it only happens on a single URL, and so it's probably tied to something on that page, versus it happens on multiple URLs, which means it's tied back to a common function that's called by all those URLs. IPs and IP locations and stuff. We aggregate on a ton of different data. In fact, you can aggregate on any sort of custom attribute you want to send as well, which really lets people kind of drill in and understand the breadth and scope of the problem, as well as whether or not they need to worry about fixing it, quite frankly. We had one example with a customer who we were sitting down and just doing a walkthrough with them, and we pulled up an error, and it had happened 10,000 times. It was a problem with their API. And they immediately started freaking out, and we looked at the aggregated data and found that it wasn't 10,000 users failing through their API. It was one user who was calling their API kind of every second or two in a very strange way. And so they quickly went from thinking, oh my God, there's a problem with the API, we're screwed, our customers use the API, to, oh, we've got a problem with one user who doesn't understand how the API works. We don't need to fix the API, we need to reach out to this person, or we need to make a small change to the API that handles this failure differently. But they went from our users are in crisis mode to, oh no, we have an education situation with one user that we can address directly. And how much engineering time did that save us scrambling around trying to find a problem that didn't exist? And then of course for, monitoring trends is useful for everyone, but especially for kind of managers and directors. I can think of lots of places I've worked where the engineering team would say, hey, we need to do a bug squash sprint, every other sprint or every third sprint. And we would do those, and at the end, we'd kind of look back and say, wow, is the app less buggy than before? Have we really improved things? Have we not improved things? We didn't really have a good way to answer whether or not the bug squash sprints had accomplished the goal of making the app less buggy. These kind of trends let you see that. Hey, we had 15 unique problems was kind of our average before, and after a couple of these sprints, we're down to 8 unique problems. Or no, we're still at 15. So either we're not squashing the right bugs, or we're not approaching this right, or somehow it's not being effective. So being able to not only find, identify, and fix these bugs, but also to be able to look back and say, yes, the time and energy we're investing in doing these things is working, or it's not, and we need a different approach. So I mean, this is kind of just showing a side-by-side, and again, this is a kind of in an agile or a waterfall sort of model and continuous deployment. The situation is a little bit different as I described, but in a typical software release, typical agile software release, you release your software and you're immediately on edge. You're kind of hoping things didn't go wrong. You're diving through the error logs. You're monitoring support queues. You're frantically regression testing. You're trying to figure out if your automated tests are giving you false positives or not. You find problems and you start immediately trying to it's an educated guess, but you're still guessing the scope of whatever issues you can find. You're scrambling around and trying to find and fix the bugs. And then you're pushing out hot fixes for those changes, and you're going right back up to the top. You're back to kind of praying and scouring for problems, and it's a stressful process. It's not very much fun from my personal experience anyway. Error monitoring it's just a better way. You release your software and you can kind of relax. If it's a big release, maybe you want to go to Airbreak and just kind of watch errors that flow in, but again, in a much more consumable way than the logs, because everything is grouped and prioritized. But if not, you can sit back and you can get your real-time error alerts in Slack or HipChat or email, whatever you want to use. And it's much easier and less painful to assess the scope of those issues. You have the applications we talked about, you have the context, you have all the information you need to understand the source of the bug, the deploy that caused it or didn't cause it, the users who were affected, et cetera. So you can pretty quickly determine, do I need to fix that problem, and do I need to fix it now, or can I fix it later? And if I do need to fix it, how can I fix it quickly by getting to the root source of the problem? So it's just quite frankly, it's just a lot less stressful way to deliver a whole lot better experience to your users and customers, and ideally find problems before they start to spiral out of control and affect as few users as possible. So look, I mean, this is basically the end of the presentation. This is as if this hasn't been a shameless enough plug, a couple of testimonials, and I'll let you guys read these for yourself, but basically we help thousands of engineering teams deliver a better user experience and focus more of their engineering time on delivering great new features and products and services rather than chasing around errors that they may or may not even know exist and know how to solve. And so really this is where I'll jump to Q&A. But Airbreak is a product that is it's free to try. It's as simple as installing a basic library in your app, very lightweight library. You can be up and running in just a couple minutes. And if there's any folks out there who would like a demo or are interested in a discount to kind of get you up and running, reach out to me, and I'm happy to oblige on either point. So, David, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. Questions? Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and ask one question. More of a big picture kind of a thing. When you talk about user experience, it seems to me that in organizations, they don't really do a good job of determining whose responsibility that is. You have the input of business rules and workflow that will make transition seamless in the application. You have designers involved who want to make it look nice with all the bells and whistles. You have developers who kind of have to put it all together. So really, is anybody looking at the overarching user experience per se, or are the business people saying, well, we'll just write the logic, and the developers are going, well, we'll just do the code, and the designers are like, okay, here's what the website's going to look like, or here's what the application is going to look like. But who ultimately is responsible for the user experience?
Yeah, it's a great point. The answer often is no one. If you ask those organizations, they would probably tell you in many cases that the product owner is the person who's responsible. But I think one of the issues you run into, at least in some of the organizations I've been in, is everyone kind of has their own slice of responsibility, and many times people do not spend quite enough mental energy making sure that that what they've developed or designed or built kind of achieves its objective. So a great example is a designer will create a beautiful set of wireframes and mockups that actually create a fantastic UX, and they kind of hand that over and say, implement this because it's beautiful and it's great and it's wonderful. And it may be, but then when the dev team goes to implement it, they might make a few changes because either technical limitations or misunderstanding of exactly what was intended or whatever it might be. The product owner might make some changes because he or she feels that there's some of it is suboptimal for conversion or some other financial metrics that they're tracking to. For example, this is a really beautiful sales page, but the call to action button is not in the optimal place, so I need to move it, and it turns out that actually causes a problem with the intended UX. And then after all of this is done and it gets implemented, there are bugs and there are errors. And so being able to having a wonderful user experience with a perfect set of pages is great if nothing goes wrong. But then if things go wrong, if it takes 15 seconds to load the page, or if the page loads with missing elements on it, or a user who takes a certain set of actions causes the page to crash, all of a sudden your well-intentioned, well-designed UX is terrible UX effectively, or it's at least, this gets back to the core of the difference between user experience and customer experience, I suppose. Is user experience is your sort of intended flow and layout and kind of your optimal, idealized world, and the customer experience is the reality, which includes things like the errors, like some of the changes that may have been made by the dev team or by the product team or by the business team. And so in a perfect world, you have a product owner who kind of understands the needs of all the constituencies, brings everyone together. You have a team that's used to working well together, and you end up with something that is compromise isn't really the right word, but the kind of aggregation of all the work, all the value brought by all those different teams, and the kind of sum is greater than its parts. But again, even in that scenario, you are going to have unintended consequences through errors, and that can, effectively ruin. The most beautiful train in the world isn't so beautiful if it goes off the tracks. It doesn't really matter how nice the train is if it's not on the tracks. So errors can have that impact even on the best laid plans.
Excellent. Thank you for that. All right. So I'd like to just take another second and remind our attendees that if they have any questions, to type it into the question tab and hit submit. And again, we'll get to as many as time will allow. So I just wanted to ask another question, if I could, and that is, it was a great presentation. I'm just curious as to how Airbrake actually works. So do I have to give access to my logs or something, or how does it operate?
No, so that's a really good question, because I know security is something people care a lot about. You don't give Airbrake any direct access into your systems. What you do is Airbrake has what are called notifiers, which is effectively just like a very lightweight, small library that you install in your app. And what it does is it listens silently in the background for errors that would occur. When that happens, it takes all the details of the error and gathers a bunch of extra information, diagnostic information, sends it to the Airbrake service using your own, a set of API keys that are unique for each customer, obviously. Takes that information and allows us to pull in all those errors and, again, do the kind of deduping and grouping logic that we do to determine if it's a unique new problem or an existing problem, and then, again, present all that information through the service. So Airbrake has no access into your information. If you remove the notifier code, information stops flowing to us, and we're none the wiser. It's incredibly safe, secure, lightweight. It's built in such a way specifically so as not to add any weight or time to your application, to not create any additional, dependencies where if something were to happen where a notice gets sent to us and it doesn't go through, that your app's not going to say, oh, well, I have to stop doing all the things I was doing because I wasn't able to send this error. It's meant to run completely separate from anything else your app is doing, so that it adds no time delays or no weight effectively to your app. So, but yeah, it's a good question, and we have different notifiers obviously for different languages. All the major languages and frameworks have some kind of notifier. Most are written and maintained by us, but all of them are completely open source, available on GitHub, so that people can see exactly what code they're putting in their app. And quite frankly, they can submit PR requests if there's something they think should be a little bit different. And that's one of the great things about the notifiers, is that everyone knows exactly what they're using and how it works. And because we get PR requests from customers all over the world, we end up with kind of the optimal solution for the largest set of people, rather than just the thing that some engineer here thought was going to be best for everyone. We kind of start from that place, and we end up in a place that just benefits everyone. So.
The other thing that I was curious to know is how do you handle task management? Does this work with Jira?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we've had a lot of internal discussion about. So what Airbrake is not trying to do is to replace your existing systems for task management or Git management. So we have integrations with, again, all the kind of major task management systems, Git management systems, notification systems. So everything from Slack and HipChat, what I mentioned earlier, to Bitbucket, GitHub, Jira, Trello, kind of you name it. And so the way it works is when a new error is found that we've never seen before, you can either create a Jira issue, as an example, automatically, or you can go do it manually and say, I want to go look at these and create one. And it will copy over the relevant details from Airbrake and, of course, link back to the Airbrake. And the reason we did that, I think it's an important distinction, is let's say you're using Jira today. Presumably that is your source of truth for who owns what, who's working on what, rather than build a second source of truth that might conflict with your first by, for example, letting you assign an Airbrake to someone else. We said, well, if you did that, you might assign the Airbrake to Tom and you might assign the Jira issue to Steve, and now who really owns it? Either no one's working on it because they think someone else owns it, or two people are working on it, both of which are bad. Said, no, let's just let you create a Jira issue from Airbrake, and track your progress for that issue in Jira, and let Airbrake be the source of information that helps you prioritize and solve that issue, but not be the source of truth on who owns it, specifically because it could contradict with the tool that you're already using. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying Airbrake is designed specifically to enhance your existing workflows and provide more information that you need to solve the problems, but not to replace your workflow for things like Jira.
Okay, that was great. So it looks like we're out of questions. So I would just throw it back to you for maybe the final 30 seconds or so. If there's one key takeaway you want people to understand from the presentation today, what would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key takeaway is, look, companies invest, and I'm sure for all the folks here on the webinar, like whatever company you work for, whether it's yours or some other company you work at, you invest considerable resources in trying to create the best possible user experience. Generally for financial reasons, but in any case, a huge amount of time and money and energy and thought is spent. And a tool like Airbrake, an error monitoring tool, to me is a critical component of that, of actually being able to deliver on the promise and put that considerable investment and resource to good use. It really only takes a small number of errors affecting a relatively small number of your customers and users to cause all sorts of problems, both in your revenue metrics, in your perception amongst users who run into problems, you don't come back and tell everyone how terrible you are, but also just the focus and the energy that your team spends on trying to track down problems, on wondering if there's problems, on trying to figure out how to solve those problems. Engineers don't get into software development because they love debugging code. They get into it because they love to build great products and services that people love to use. And just put simply, Airbrake is a tool that makes the process of creating those services and tools just much more efficient and much, I don't want to say easier because there's nothing easy about software development, but it's designed so they can spend less time wasted on troubleshooting and digging around and stressing, and more so focused on the things that are going to make the product and service great, and quite frankly the things they probably love to do, which is just writing great code.
I met a guy once who told me that he did get into developing for debugging, but I didn't believe him, and he was kind of an odd duck anyway.
It's a necessary part of the job, and it's fun to solve problems, but my hunch is most engineers would rather solve new and interesting problems rather than resolve a problem they inadvertently caused.
Absolutely. Okay, so I would like to thank you, Joe, for a great presentation. Joe Godfrey, again, CEO of Airbrake.io, who, of course, is the sponsors of this webinar today. And I would like to thank all the attendees who hung in with us today. I'm apologizing for a sore throat and a cold that I have. Again, thanks everyone, and thank you, Joe. Thanks, Airbrake. And until next time, again, I'm Dave Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times. So long, everybody.
Thanks, David.